Walk through any American neighborhood in the 1970s and you would see something that looks almost alien today. Kids everywhere, alone. 6-year-olds walking to school in packs. 10-year-olds riding bikes across town to the public pool. Teenagers building forts in the woods, unsupervised for hours. In 1979, nearly half of all American children walked or biked to school without an adult. Today, that number has collapsed to roughly 11%. This was not because parents loved their children less. It was because the entire architecture of American childhood operated on a completely different set of assumptions. Kids were expected to fend for themselves. Streets belonged to children, not just cars. Risk was considered a developmental necessity, not a legal liability. The 1970s represented the last moment in American history when children had genuine sovereignty over their own time, their own bodies, and their own neighborhoods. What followed was not progress. It was the death of independence we may never see again. Start with the physical world these children inhabited. In the 1970s, a child's home range, the distance they could travel alone from their front door, was genuinely vast. A landmark study tracking 4 generations showed this collapse in stark terms. The great-grandfather in 1919 could roam 6 miles from home at age 8. His grandson in 1950 still had 1 mile of freedom. By 1979, the range had contracted to about 880 yards, but children could still bike to the pool, explore the neighborhood park, and disappear for hours. Then the bottom fell out. By 2007, that same family's 8-year-old could walk only 300 yards to the end of the street. The child of the 1970s lived under the streetlight rule. As long as you were home when those lights flickered on at dusk, your time was yours. No GPS trackers, no scheduled activities, no adults asking where you were going. You left after breakfast and returned for dinner, and in between, you were a sovereign agent navigating your own world. This was not neglect. This was the operating assumption of an entire culture. Children is capable. That assumption was built into the city itself. In 1969, nearly 50% of American children walked or biked to school independently. For those living within a mile, that number was 89%. Schools were small and local, embedded in neighborhoods rather than consolidated into distant campuses. Kids walked in groups, learned to cross intersections, and navigated using landmarks and memory rather than a screen. This daily practice built spatial intelligence, the ability to form mental maps and find your way in the world. The 1970s child learned wayfinding by necessity. The modern child never has to. But the geography was only half of it. The culture itself operated on a different logic. The 1970s represented the peak of what sociologists call benign neglect, a deliberate stepping back by adults that forced children to regulate themselves. This was the latchkey generation. As divorce rates climbed and more mothers entered the workforce, an estimated 40% of Gen X children returned to empty homes after school, house keys dangling from cords around their necks. Between 3 in the afternoon and 6 in the evening, they were on their own. They made snacks, they did homework, they settled disputes with siblings, they managed their own time. Developmental research sees this unsupervised time as a daily exercise in problem-solving and autonomy. These children learn to fend for themselves through necessity. They learn to evaluate risk, manage boredom, and handle conflict without running to an authority figure. They developed distress tolerance, the ability to sit with discomfort and work through it. Neighborhoods functioned as collective oversight systems. The village approach to child rearing was still intact. Neighbors felt empowered to scold or redirect children who were not their own. This created a distal safety net. Adults were watching, but from a distance. Children had freedom, but not total anonymity. Today, that social capital has evaporated. The village dissolved, and with it, the informal structures that made unsupervised play possible. If you're someone who values understanding how culture shapes generations, you'll want to subscribe to follow along for more stories like this. The playground equipment of the 1970s reflected this same philosophy. Metal slides that scorched your legs in summer, merry-go-rounds that spun fast enough to fling you off, tall jungle gyms with no padding below. This wasn't sadism, it was pedagogy. The equipment was designed to teach risk assessment. You climbed something high, evaluated whether you could make it, tested your own limits. Sometimes you fell, sometimes you got hurt, and you learned. Modern research validates what seemed obvious then. Risky play is a developmental necessity. Children who engage in it develop better spatial cognition, stronger executive function, and greater emotional regulation. They learn their own physical limits through direct feedback. Paradoxically, this early exposure to manageable risk protects them from more serious injuries later, because they've built an intuitive sense of what their bodies can and cannot do. Playgrounds in the 1970s also offered loose parts, wooden planks, tires, and scrap materials children could move and transform. A modern playground has fixed equipment with one intended use. An empty lot in the 1970s offered infinite configurations. Children built forts, dug holes, and created entire imaginary worlds. This required negotiation and problem-solving with peers, all without adult mediation. Without adults constantly hovering, children had to resolve their own disputes. Someone cheated at kickball, someone got left out. In the 1970s, children worked it out themselves. They learned to negotiate, to read social cues, to adjust their behavior. The 1970s child left childhood with a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics because they had spent thousands of hours practicing without a referee. Latchkey kids learned to cook basic meals, manage household chores, handle emergencies. They developed frugality, saving allowance money over weeks to buy something they wanted. They learned to wait, to endure boredom, to sit with their own thoughts. There was no screen to fill every empty moment. Boredom taught you to generate your own entertainment, to find interest in the world around you. This built what researchers call internal locus of control, the belief that you can influence outcomes through your own actions. The 1970s child built self-worth through mastery of real-world challenges. Making a friend, navigating a new route home, fixing something that broke. These were tangible accomplishments that required no external validation. Modern children seek validation from digital platforms where worth is quantified in likes. The 1970s child did not need an audience. They also developed street smarts, the ability to assess people and situations quickly. Because they were alone in public, they learned to read body language, to sense when something felt wrong, to trust their instincts. They talked to shopkeepers and asked strangers for directions. These interactions taught them that most people were safe, that the world was not uniformly dangerous, and that they could handle themselves in it. Now consider the backdrop. The 1970s were not objectively safer than today. Violent crime rates were climbing and would peak in the early 1990s. The homicide rate in 1970 was higher than now, and yet parents let their children roam because the perception of danger had not yet metastasized into the all-consuming fear that defines modern parenting. The shift happened in the 1980s. High-profile missing children cases, Adam Walsh and Eaton Patz, were broadcast on the new 24-hour news cycle, creating the perception of an epidemic. The faces of missing children appeared on milk cartons. America convinced itself that predators lurked everywhere. The data never supported this. Stranger abductions remain extraordinarily rare. roughly 100 per year out of 72 million children. Odds of 1 in 720,000. You are statistically more at risk driving your child to school than letting them walk. But perception, not data, drives behavior. Violent crime has plummeted since the early 1990s. Homicide rates have halved. Robberies have dropped nearly 80%. And yet, in the vast majority of surveys since 1993, most Americans believe crime is increasing. This perception gap has reshaped childhood entirely. Parents today are more fearful than parents in the objectively more dangerous 1970s. And that fear has translated into constant supervision and the effective house arrest of an entire generation. The result has been legal as well as cultural. In the 1970s, letting your 10-year-old walk to the park was normal parenting. Today it can be criminalized as neglect. In 2024, Brittany Patterson was arrested and handcuffed after her 10-year-old son walked into town alone in Georgia. Authorities demanded she install a tracking app and she refused. Parents across the country have faced criminal charges for allowing their children the same freedoms that were universal in the 1970s. In response, a movement has emerged. As of 2025, 11 states have passed reasonable childhood independence laws protecting parents from prosecution for allowing age-appropriate, unsupervised activities. These laws explicitly state that children do not need constant adult supervision to be safe. This legislative shift represents a recognition that we criminalized normal development and that the model from the 1970s was not reckless. It was essential. What replaced the free-range childhood was the phone-based childhood. From 2010 to 2015, smartphones became ubiquitous among adolescents. The freedom children once found in physical space was traded for the illusion of freedom in digital space. But these are not equivalent. Physical play involves exercise, fresh air, and face-to-face negotiation. Screen time involves none of that. It is sedentary, algorithmically manipulated, designed to maximize engagement, not growth. The mental health consequences have been catastrophic. Adolescents today report anxiety and depression at rates 8 to 10 times higher than for children in the 1970s. Smartphone ownership at age 12 is associated with increased risks of depression, obesity, and insufficient sleep. The child of the 1970s played. The modern child consumes content. These are not the same thing. The 1970s represented a sweet spot in American history. It combined urban walkability with a nurturing parenting philosophy, all before digital displacement and hyper-protective legal culture. The result was a generation raised with unusual independence, resilience, and practical capability. They learned to solve problems without a manual, to tolerate discomfort, to assess risk, to handle themselves in the world. The collapse of that model was not inevitable. It was a choice, driven by irrational fear, car-centric urban design, the dissolution of community, and the rise of digital entertainment. We did not protect children by taking away their freedom. We made them more fragile, more anxious, more dependent. What we lost was sovereignty, the ability of a child to own their own time, to make their own choices, to experience consequences in a low-stakes environment. The 1970s gave children that. The world they built through scraped knees, long bike rides, boredom, conflict, and exploration was one where they learned to trust themselves. And that trust became the foundation for everything that followed. The movement to reclaim that model is growing. Parents are pushing back against fear-driven norms, advocating for walkable cities, and demanding legal protection for independence. Recognition is spreading that the 1970s were not just better by accident. They were better because the environment allowed children to do what they are developmentally designed to do: explore, risk, fail, learn, and grow. That was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and we abandoned it.